You know the feeling that arrives around the 4-month mark. Not always 4 months, sometimes 3, sometimes 6, but there is a point in the arc of almost everything you have committed to where the initial quality changes. The new city stops being new. The relationship moves past the stage where everything is still being discovered. The project or practice or version of yourself you decided to become has been going long enough that you can see not just its promise, but its actual shape, its specific limitations, the specific difficulty it is asking of you, the thing it requires that you have been quietly hoping you would not have to give. The forward motion now requires something different, something harder and less immediately rewarding than what was required before. You can feel the edge of something you are being asked to enter, and this is where, if you look honestly at the pattern, you have left. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it is a slow fade, a reduced investment, a growing interest in something new that you frame as evolution, as growth, as the natural unfolding of an expanding person. And sometimes that framing is accurate. But sometimes, more often than you have named it, and more consistently than the individual departures suggest when evaluated separately, it is a departure from the specific moment when real change was about to be asked of you, not a random exit, an exit at the same point in the arc. The point just before the depth. The mechanism has a name. It is not weakness, and it is not inconsistency in any ordinary sense. Kierkegaard identified it as the aesthetic mode of existence, the life organized around the quality of new experience, which is vivid and genuinely valuable, but which has a structural feature almost no one names. It has a ceiling. Because the aesthetic mode cannot deepen without ceasing to be purely aesthetic. Depth requires repetition without novelty. Depth requires staying in the place that has stopped being new long enough that what is there begins to work on you rather than the other way around. What you have been calling growth is, in specific and recoverable ways, flight from depth. The promise here is not that you should stop beginning things. The promise is more precise, that you will be able to recognize the moment of flight when it arrives, to distinguish between the departure that is genuine forward movement and the departure that is avoidance. That capacity, seeing the moment when you are about to leave for the wrong reason, is the only real purchase on a pattern this entrenched. If this channel is where you want to think about the patterns you've been calling something else, subscribe. This is that work. And to know when you feel the pull toward a fresh start, whether you are moving towards something or running from something that had just begun to ask what it was always going to ask. Most people who have this pattern have also built a vocabulary for it, a set of reframes that make each departure legible as growth. And the vocabulary is not wrong exactly, which is what makes it so effective at delaying the larger recognition. Kierkegaard was trying to describe something his contemporaries were not willing to see. He called it the aesthetic stage of existence. Not aesthetic in the sense of art appreciation, but in the original Greek sense of aesthesis, sensation, experience, the immediate quality of what is happening now. The person in the aesthetic mode is organized around the quality of experience, around what is vivid and fresh and opening. This is not shallow. Kierkegaard noted carefully that the aesthete can be highly cultivated, capable of intense engagement with ideas and people and work. What the aesthetic mode structurally cannot do is sustain depth over time without undergoing a kind of internal crisis. The crisis arrives because the aesthetic mode has a specific relationship to what Kierkegaard called repetition. Not repetition in the sense of doing the same thing again, but in his technical sense. The capacity to return to the same commitment after the freshness has gone and to find there's something that is only available on the other side of the vividness. The aesthete can engage deeply in the early phase. Engaging deeply over time requires entering a phase that looks and feels like diminishment, the loss of discovery, the replacement of the opening quality with something harder and less obviously rewarding. The aesthete experiences this phase not as depth, but as decline. And the response to perceived decline is renewal, a new relationship, a new city, a new project, a new account of who you are. What the second phase actually feels like from inside is important to name precisely because it is almost always misread. It does not feel like difficulty in any way that announces itself as meaningful difficulty. It does not feel like the good kind of hard. It feels like the thing has lost its quality, like the juice has gone out of it, like you are sustaining something that is no longer sustaining you. And the feeling is accurate in the narrow sense. The thing has changed. What the feeling misreads is the significance of the change. It reads diminishment as depletion, when it is actually the transition from surface to depth, the moment when the thing is asking for something different from what it has been asking. And the something different is precisely what would produce the change that the beginning only promised. This is why the aesthetic mode sometimes appears to be the most generative mode. The constant renewal produces real novelty. The person organized around it begins more, encounters more, experiences the first vivid layer of more things than almost anyone around them. What they do not encounter is the second layer. And what the second layer contains is the specific thing this particular commitment was going to require, the cost that was always waiting behind the opening phase, the cost that only reveals itself after the beginning has been left behind. Here is the behavior you have probably never had named precisely this way. There is something in the beginning itself, distinct from any interest in the thing being begun, that is part of what you are pursuing. The openness of it, the fact that it has not yet shown you what it is going to ask. The new relationship is compelling partly because it is not yet asking what the previous relationship eventually asked. The new city is compelling partly because you are not yet accountable to it in the specific ways that generate felt obligation. The new project is compelling partly because it has not yet revealed the particular difficulty it is going to require you to confront. You are drawn to the beginning because the beginning is before the cost. This is not a character flaw. The beginning is genuinely good. The opening phase of almost anything real carries a quality of possibility that is not available later. The quality of not yet being defined by what you will turn out to be capable of. The beginning is not something to be suspicious of in itself. What is worth being suspicious of is the pattern of endings, the specific point in the arc at which the endings keep occurring, and what was happening there each time. The pattern is not about what you leave, it is about when you leave it. And the when has been consistent in a way the what has obscured. William James understood what becomes of a person's capacity for depth when the fresh start pattern grows habitual. His account of habit was not descriptive in the casual sense. Habit is the laying down of encoding, the path that with use requires less activation to fire. The groove deepens, and the groove that deepens in the fresh start pattern is not a groove of engagement. It is a groove of departure. Every time you leave at the depth threshold, the point where something real is about to be asked, you make it slightly more automatic to leave at that threshold next time. The groove does not simply wait for the familiar point. Over time, it begins to anticipate it. The disengagement process starts earlier in each subsequent commitment because the groove has learned the shape of what precedes the threshold and begins running at the first signs. The restlessness arrives sooner. The interest in what might come next surfaces earlier in the arc. The current commitment begins to look less vivid against an imagined alternative, while the threshold is still weeks away. This acceleration is not obvious until you notice it. But if you map the arc of your last 3 significant commitments, how long into each one the early energy lasted before the disengagement began, you may find the interval has been shortening, the groove has been learning, it has gotten more efficient. What feels like growing self-knowledge about what you need may partly be the groove becoming faster at initiating its own sequence. James called habit the flywheel of civilization, and the full weight of that metaphor is relevant here. A flywheel spinning in one direction does not reverse because you understand that it should. It reverses through sustained application of force in the other direction for longer than feels necessary until the momentum changes. The groove of departure does not dissolve because you recognize it. Recognition is not reversal. This distinction is worth staying with because the feeling of having understood the pattern is one of the most reliable substitutes for having changed it. Understanding the pattern can itself become a fresh start. A new beginning at self-knowledge that permits you to move on from the specific thing the understanding was pointing toward. The thing you are still inside, the commitment still asking, the depth threshold still waiting. This is the most sophisticated form the pattern takes. The insight that replaces the staying. The person who has genuinely understood what they have been doing with a clarity and precision they find impressive, and who uses that understanding as the occasion to move on. The understanding was real, the clarity was real, and none of it required staying, which means the groove has found a new tool, self-knowledge itself, and is using it to generate its cleanest departure yet. Kierkegaard identified a concept he called the demonic, and he used the word precisely, not as a moral designation, but as a description of a specific psychological structure. The demonic, for Kierkegaard, is the self that is closed. The self that has protected itself so thoroughly from the openness that genuine encounter requires that it becomes, over time, incapable of being entered, not evil, defended. The demonic does not present as refusal from the inside. It presents as discernment, as knowing yourself well enough to recognize when something is not right for you, as protecting your energy, as the clarity that comes from accumulated experience with your own needs. The demonic is sophisticated precisely because it has had practice. It has learned the exact vocabulary that converts avoidance into growth narrative, that makes every departure look like a becoming rather than a flight. What Kierkegaard saw, and what makes this analysis so difficult to receive, is that the demonic is not accessible to straightforward critique because the demonic always has reasons, good reasons, reasons that are often partially accurate. The closure presents itself as clarity. The avoidance presents itself as self-knowledge. And the person in the pattern has access to genuinely compelling justifications for every departure, which is precisely what makes the pattern so difficult to see from inside it. The tell is not in the individual departure. It is in the structure across departures. Not why you left this thing, but at what point in the arc of this thing, and the thing before it, and the thing before that. Think concretely about the most recent thing you left. Not a relationship necessarily, but the practice, the project, the city, the version of yourself you had started building. Locate the moment in its arc when the quality of what was being asked changed, when the initial energy required a different kind of fuel, and ask honestly whether you encountered the specific thing this commitment was going to require, or whether you left while it was still in the process of becoming clear what that thing was. Not whether the departure was justified. It probably was, in part. Not whether the narrative you built around it contained real elements. It almost certainly did. The question is simpler and harder than either of those. Were you present long enough to find out what this particular commitment was going to cost? Or did you leave while the cost was still assembling? If the departure happened before the full ask arrived, if you can locate, in retrospect, the moment where the thing you left had just started to reveal what it was going to require, then what you called a growth decision was also simultaneously something else. And the something else has been consistent across departures in a way that evaluating each exit individually has consistently obscured. Here is a more specific diagnostic. Think about the growth narrative you told yourself about the most significant departure you have made. The story about why you left, what you learned, why it was necessary. Now locate the moment in that story where you knew the story, where you had already arrived at the interpretation of what this was and what it meant. And ask whether you left before or after that moment of narrative arrival. Because if the narrative arrived first, if you knew what this was before you had finished finding out, then the narrative is not a record of what happened. It is a version of what happened that arrived in time to substitute for what was still happening. And the substitution has been so clean and has been performed so many times that it no longer feels like substitution. It feels like the story. Kierkegaard's concept of repetition is one of the least discussed ideas in his work and one of the most precisely defined. He distinguished it from recollection. Recollection is the backward movement, the self that generates meaning from what has already been, that lives in memory and in the quality of what is past. Repetition is the forward movement, the self that returns to the same commitment after the first vividness has gone, and finds in that return something that was not available at the beginning, something only available because of the staying. He believed repetition was the condition for genuine selfhood, not exciting selfhood, deep selfhood. The self that can be genuinely known by another person or by itself requires depth. Depth requires repetition. And repetition requires tolerating the phase that does not feel like growth. The phase that feels like remaining in a room you have already looked at from every angle, in which the obvious interest has been exhausted, and in which what is now being asked is not to look, but to stay with the discomfort of having nowhere new to look. The person who has lived primarily in the aesthetic mode, generating fresh starts to avoid the repetition that depth requires, is not shallow. They may be extraordinarily rich in first-layer experience. They have encountered the opening of many things. What they have not encountered is what is underneath. And what is underneath that layer in every significant commitment is the specific thing the commitment was waiting to ask, the thing that only becomes askable after the beginning is over, that was still forming when you left. There is a self that could have been built in the time spent generating fresh starts. Not a better self in any abstract sense. A different self, one that knows what it is like to have stayed past the familiar departure point, to have found out what was on the other side of the threshold, to have been changed by something rather than having moved on before the changing could begin. That self does not arrive through intention. It arrives through duration, through the accumulation of having stayed. James complicates the Kierkegaardian framing in a specific way worth naming. Kierkegaard framed the shift from aesthetic to ethical existence, the decision to stop running and to commit genuinely, as something like a leap, a moment of will against the pull of the aesthetic mode. James would have found this framing incomplete, not because the choice is not real, but because the choice does not land in a neutral system waiting to be directed. It lands in a system that has been encoding the departure pattern for years. The leap is real. What the leap lands in is a body and nervous system that know how to leave. This does not make change impossible. It makes change different from what the concept of a single, decisive leap implies. The reversal of the departure groove is not an event. It is a duration, a sustained practice of staying past the point where the groove begins pulling, not once but many times, long enough for a different groove to begin forming. And when you do stay past the familiar threshold, you will feel the pull of the fresh start more intensely rather than less, because the groove has been deepened by years of use. Staying past the familiar point registers as wrongness, as not doing what has always been done here. The discomfort of changing the habit and the discomfort of depth feel nearly identical from inside. This is the most precise difficulty the pattern presents. You cannot tell them apart in the early stages. The only way to find out which you are experiencing is to stay long enough to find out. And the staying itself is what the groove is organized to prevent. There is no diagnostic that works at a distance. No internal test you can run that reliably distinguishes this is the groove resisting change from this is genuine incompatibility telling me to leave. Both feel like the same quality of wrongness. Both come with reasons. Both can be narrated as growth or as self-knowledge or as the recognition that this particular thing was never going to serve what you actually need. The distinction is not available before the fact. It is only available in retrospect from the position of someone who has stayed long enough to find out, which is precisely the position the groove prevents you from reaching. There is one more thing that tends not to be said about this pattern, because it is the version that is hardest to receive. The pattern is not a failure of commitment. It is a failure of a specific kind of courage that does not have an obvious name. The courage to be changed by something rather than to change it, to leave it, or to reframe it into something more manageable. The fresh start mode is fluent at the second and third of these. It can change what it engages with. It can leave. What it systematically avoids is being changed, because being changed requires a loss of control over who you are at the end of the process. It requires entering a commitment without knowing what it will make of you. And the fresh start, however it is framed, is always partly the refusal of that exposure. The difference between committing and being changed by a commitment is not obvious until you have experienced both. Committing is active. It involves decision, direction, the application of self to something. Being changed is something that happens to you while you stay. It requires the specific passivity of not intervening, not reframing, not redirecting, not generating a narrative about what this is turning out to be before you have found out what it is. Being changed requires that you be present for something long enough that it has time to do what it is going to do to you. And the person organized around fresh starts cannot do this, because the fresh start is always available as an alternative to being done something to. Camus observed, writing about something adjacent, that the impulse to impose meaning on an experience before the experience is complete is one of the most reliable forms of bad faith available to human beings. The premature resolution, the decision to know what this was before allowing it to show you. The move from presence to narrative before the presence has done its work. Every growth story you have told about a departure is a premature resolution, not because it is false, it contains real things, but because it was narrated before the commitment had shown you what it was still preparing to ask. The story arrived while the preparation was still underway. And once you have the story, the thing the story is about no longer needs to be lived. It has been converted into meaning, which is cleaner and less demanding than the experience it summarized. You have been telling yourself a story about why you keep starting over. The story is not wrong. It contains real elements, genuine incompatibilities, genuine growth, real moments where the previous chapter had run its course. What the story does not contain in the version you have been telling is the part where you left before you found out what the commitment was still preparing to ask, not what it was already asking, what it was still forming when you departed. The thing it contained that you will therefore never know it contained. The question is not whether you have grown through starting over. You have. The question is what remains at the depth threshold of each thing you have moved on from, left there, still forming, never encountered, and whether you are willing to call that what it is. That question does not close. It opens. If something in that landed saw, leave a comment that says, "I've been calling it growth."